Well, Aaron, welcome to the Bookshelf Conversation.
Thank you very much.
Your new book intrigues me because it is about books, and anyone who's been following this blog for as long as it's been going on knows of my uh, love of books and information about books. So, your new book is 10 Books That Changed Baseball. And in your prologue, preface, you also say that these books changed America. Now, the first thing I'm interested in is why you didn't include America in the title of the book, as well as baseball change. And it is like you say, it's a bold statement, and I'm,
Well,
I'm just curious the decision in that regard.
I should first say that I'm somewhat intimidated by this conversation because normally when I'm talking about baseball books, almost always when I'm talking about baseball books, I'm talking to someone who has read a lot fewer baseball books than me. In this case, that's not the case. So I can't bluff. You'll call me on it. But to your question of the title, um, this seems sort of to duck the question, but I left it up to the publisher. I gave the publisher a couple of choices, one of which was Books That Changed America, and one of which was Books That Changed Baseball. I deferred to their expertise. I think both titles actually would be accurate. I mean, I do talk about books that change baseball, how it's perceived or how it's played. Certainly, I talk about books that did that. When I'm getting more grandiose, or maybe I should say more ambitious, not grandiose. When I'm getting more grandiose, I think I do talk about some books that where their impact, their influence was greater than just on baseball. I mean, when you talk about um, Satchel Paige in his book, an argument can be made that it played a role in furthering integration in both baseball and America. So I'm not backing away from the more grandiose or ambitious statement that some of these books changed America. But I think maybe the publisher felt they were on safer ground to stick with books that changed baseball.
Which is fair. You know, we were all pretty much slaves to the ultimate decision of the publisher. So, so that's very fair. So these are 10 books, and as you noted, as I noted in my book, these are not necessarily the best books about the game, but they do have an impact on either how the game was played, how the game was reported, other ancillary effects. I mean, certainly, I have to keep taking my glasses off here.
Ron, wouldn't you have argued that in 501, I mean, you were sort of arguing that these were the best. I mean, maybe you were arguing these were the ones most worth reading,
Yes,
which is not quite the same as the
right.
best, but there's a lot of overlap
Yes,
between
there is. Oh,
worth
certainly.
reading and the best. Well, I was really trying to do something entirely different from what you were doing, or what Mike Shannon did in his book about 100 baseball books. I I mean, there's obviously overlap. There are certainly books I talk about, which I think are wonderful books, but I was really trying to say these change something, that that they changed, as I said, either the way we looked at the game. In the case of Bill James, for example, I mean, it certainly should make any list of the best books, in my opinion, the baseball abstract, but it also changed the way we understood the game. I mean, people think of him as a statistician, but he did more than accumulate, collect, calculate numbers. I mean, he challenged baseball dogma, and the game has been played differently uh, since James. So, I mean that's a really different criteria than best books or even most worth reading. I mean, I think, for example, I probably left out some books that would will ultimately deserve to, would already deserve to be on the list of best books, and would ultimately deserve to be on the on a list of most influential books, simply because I was biased against older books, I think, because you can't tell the influence of new books yet. It takes time to see what impact they'll have on the game or on America. So perhaps I'm being too defensive right,
Oh,
right
no, no,
from the
no.
start, but I really wasn't trying to do the best baseball books. There are, you know, again, it's not exactly what you did, but it's close enough to what you did that I didn't see a need to try to do that again.
Mhm. No, no, that's perfectly fair. And I'm sure just as uh, one of the reasons I didn't want to use the word, there are a few words I don't like using in my writing. Best, complete, because it's never going to be complete until there's no more baseball. Uh, I don't like using superlatives because that it's a matter of opinion. Uh, Someone might look at Ball Four now and say it's not the best book on, but it certainly was a game changer. It certainly
Right.
influenced the way people perceived the game. It changed the way we thought about our air quote heroes in sports. And I can't help think that in all of the memoirs since then, it's almost been a case of, well, how can I up the ante a little bit? So you'll have
I
somebody
know.
like Lenny Dykstra who will curse his way through 300 pages and say nothing, but he's trying to be provocative just by his behavior and what he's done. Uh,
I know it for a fact that that's the case, and I even am embarrassed to admit that to some minor extent, I even played a role in that. I mean, I used to be an editor at Doubleday and then in Simon and Schuster in the 80s, and I can remember that, you know, when players would come to my office with their agents to pitch a new book, the first question I would ask um, would be along the lines, I mean, it maybe wouldn't be this explicit, but it would be along the lines of, what do you have to say that's controversial, like Ball Four? What do you have to say that's going to get headlines like Ball Four, which is not really the best way to decide what books to publish. There were plenty of bad, have been plenty of bad tell-alls told. Um, I you know, you may remember the genre. Saturday Night Live even parodied the genre. Do you remember Chico Escuela,
sure.
who was played by Garrett Morris on Saturday Night Live? And I remember Chico Escuela, a made-up New York Met, had written an entirely made-up book called Bad Stuff About the Mets, in which he uh, mentioned, for example, the scandals were like Tom Seaver had once taken 2 parking spaces, or Ed Kranepool had borrowed his soap in the locker room and never returned it. I mean, this would be parodying the genre of tell-all baseball books that started with Jim Bouton, and that led to some good books, but some pretty bad books as
Mhm.
well. I would argue, by the way, that Bouton's does stand up. I mean, I had read it in 1970 when it came out. I was only 14, but I remember reading it. But I read it again, last year, and I was still laughing. It's still a very funny book. It may not be quite as scandalous as it once was. The idea that players took drugs is hardly shocking to us today. The idea that players, the idea that general managers were or can be stingy, or that owners can be selfish, or that players are not heroic all the time, is hardly a shock to us today. But the book still stands up, I think. It's not so scandalous, but it's still very funny.
And I'm wondering now if Bowden, like you said, this was published in the very early 70s, where the standards of what is shocking is different than today. I'm sure Boughton could have written as players write today about the more sexual antics of the players, the more drug-related antics of the players. He chose not to for I don't know why. I mean, maybe he wouldn't have found a publisher in those days to put out something as scandalous as his was. This was eons more scandalous than that.
Yeah, I mean, even things that seem scandalous then just don't seem that scandalous
Right,
now.
right.
It's, I mean, even things that people were outraged about. I mean, I think he wrote about Mickey Mantle hitting a home run when he was drunk, or about Whitey Ford putting junk on, on a ball. Um, and then Ford and Mantle, just a few years later, were writing a dual biography, and they were talking about the same things. And I think Boughton really changed the way you write about baseball. Even as a reporter, he went on after he retired, you may remember, to be a TV sportscaster, and I think he changed sports reporting too. He brought the same irreverence that he brought to the book to sports reporting. I remember one funny story. It wasn't in Ball 4. I think he told it in one of his later books. I'm glad you didn't take it personally, where he wanted to, I can't remember if he was working for ABC or CBS in New York, but he wanted to cover the Yankees at spring training. And the Yankees were still too furious over Ball 4. They wouldn't let him on the field. They wouldn't let him they wouldn't let him in the locker room. So he donned a wig and a mustache and snuck on the field, pretending to be a 21-year-old prospect trying out as a pitcher. And the plan fell apart when someone asked him what year he was born. And he remembered that he was supposed to be 21, but he couldn't do the math quickly enough in his head. So I think he blurted out 1961, which would have made him 12 years old. And that was the end of his plan to get into the Yankee clubhouse that way.
Now, your book includes a bunch of different subgenres within baseball literature. Certainly, the natural changed the way baseball fiction was presented. Prior to that, I don't think you had much in the way of anything dark. It was all like heroic. It was written for kids. Baseball fiction was mostly written for kids prior to the natural. How was it received at the time?
Um, it was taken seriously at the time. I don't know how popular it was. It was an early novel of Malamud, and he became renowned as an important novelist later. There were critics who didn't like it because it was, he was the first to, I don't want to say absolutely the first, but one of the first to take baseball fiction as a serious adult subject. And he also made baseball about more than baseball. He very much applied to baseball various mythologies. I mean, there is Homer allusions to Homer, there are allusions to the Arthurian legend. Even the team that he played for, the New York Knights, sort of alludes to Arthurian legends, and Wonder Boy, his bat, has a lot in common with Excalibur. Excalibur was Arthur's sword that had magical properties. So there were critics, to get back to your question, who thought, all of this mythology is undercutting a good baseball story. I think the story still stands up as a baseball story too, but it got mixed reviews, and the same is true, by the way, for the movie starring
Mhm.
Robert Redford. I think Roger Angel, who's was one of the greatest baseball writers of all time, hated the movie, and I think I I personally have mixed feelings about The Natural. I mean, Malamud was certainly a great and important writer. I have mixed feelings about how well it works as a baseball story, but there's no question about its influence. I mean, after Malamud, serious novelists didn't have to be embarrassed about baseball as their topic. After Malamud, you had people like uh, Coover in the Universal Baseball Association, or Philip Roth writing what he called the Great American Novel, which was an ironic title. It wasn't the greatest of his novels even, but the point, or you had Kinsella writing Shoeless Joe. All of these were serious novelists who chose baseball as their subject, and I think it was Malamud who made it a respectable subject for novelists.
I'm going to move on a little bit to The Boys of Summer, which I think came along at the perfect time because it was obviously meant for baby boomers who were coming into a certain age. And certainly the nostalgia factor was incredibly important. Uh, could a book like that have been written about any other team besides the Brooklyn Dodgers?
I mean, I think it could be, but it wouldn't have had the same impact.
Right.
I
That's
don't
what I meant.
know. It didn't create the genre of the books about the Dodgers, but it certainly the genre certainly exploded after that. I remember searching Brooklyn Dodgers on Amazon, and I think I came up with like 700 plus hits. Um, why the Dodgers are so popular? I think part of it has to do, of course, with, as you said, people reaching a certain age and being nostalgic for their youth. Part of it, and Kahn captured that. I mean, he wrote about not just the Dodgers, but about the Brooklyn of his youth. He wrote about he it was a somewhat romanticized view of Brooklyn, but it was deeply moving. And other writers have done it. Peter Golenbach, for example, many writers have written about the Dodgers, and many good writers. But Kahn did it so eloquently. He so captured that nostalgia that I think it not only led to many more Brooklyn Dodger books, but this is one of the examples which I would use of a baseball book changing not just baseball but America. I think the renaissance of inner cities is one cannot say it was caused by Boys of Summer, but I think a book like Kahn's was a factor in the same the children and the grandchildren of the people who left Brooklyn to go to Long Island or to go to the suburbs of New York, or the children and grandchildren of people who left inner cities in general to move to the suburbs, have moved back, to Brooklyn and cities. Part of the Renaissance, the gentrification of cities is, again, I can't argue it's just because of Roger Kahn and Boys of Summer. There were other books, there were other factors, but I think it was a factor in drawing people back to some of the people whose parents and grandparents had left Brooklyn realized they missed, maybe they liked having a house of their own, but they missed the neighborhood that Brooklyn was.
There's just something about Brooklyn. I mean, it's a staple of all the movies about World War II. It was always a
Right.
kid from Brooklyn. How are the Dodgers doing?
Yep.
Using that as like when you're confronting the enemy, you ask them a question about the Dodgers. What place they're getting the Dodgers?
if not about Babe Ruth.
Right.
But I mean, I think the the other factor in the huge nostalgia for Brooklyn and the Dodgers is that they left. I think that left such a hole in Brooklyn. And again, I'm not saying that the decline of Brooklyn was solely because of the Dodgers leaving, but it was such a symbolic act. It's so symbolized to people the loss of that neighborhood, the loss of that of what they so loved, that I think that added to the nostalgia. It wasn't just nostalgia for one's youth, which was a big part of the appeal of Boys of Summer. It was also nostalgia for something that, well, I guess one's youth is gone too, but it was nostalgia for a team that was gone, or at least moved.
One of the, some might argue that it was because Brooklyn was in decline that the Dodgers moved.
Yes, well, I think that's I think the argument that Brooklyn caused the decline is a gross oversimplification. I mean, the Dodgers may everybody loves to demonize Walter O'Malley, and because he left, well, the team was still drawing near 1 million people and still profitable. But Brooklyn was in decline, and Ebbets Field was in decline. I mean, people remember Ebbets Field. I am a bit too young to have gone there, but I can't remember Ebbets Field. But I've read descriptions of it that are, it was the most wonderful place in the world. But I've also read descriptions of it that it was dirty and filthy, and you didn't want to go to the bathroom there.
I get a little notice from Zoom that we are running out of time, but I just wanted to quickly touch on something that I really think did change America as well as baseball, and that's the Rotisserie League Baseball by Glenn Wagner, because certainly fantasy sports have become a multi-billion-dollar industry.
It's a huge industry. I mean, the last figure I saw was like 60 million people play it. And, again, you can't say, and again, this you could argue has changed the way that we're fans. Some people criticize fantasy baseball because, instead of rooting for the Dodgers or the Yankees, you're rooting for the players that you drafted and don't care as much about your team.
Right.
I mean, I would argue fantasy players, because they do pay such close attention to the game, they're actually good fans. I remember one quote that was from Glenn Wagner's book on one of the editions of his book, in which I don't remember if it's Wagner. I think he's quoting Steve Wolf, who's one of the original fantasy players, who says, well, something along the lines of, you may think of this as just fantasy, but we prefer to think of this as real, and the Chicago Cubs as a fantasy team. And I think rotisserie baseball, and to some extent the book, changed not just the way we're fans, but I think you can argue it did change America. USA Today, for example, I remember, I don't know if you were a fantasy player, but in the early years, before everything was on the internet, before you could get the box scores right away and the statistics instantly, I remember people would buy USA Today because it was the newspaper that had box scores from the West Coast. It had all the box scores. And I think in that sense, fantasy baseball fueled the growth of USA Today and changed journalism. Again, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's the sole cause. I certainly wouldn't say that fantasy baseball fueled the internet, but fantasy players were among the earliest and most avid users of the web. So it's another example, I think, of a book that changed baseball, but arguably changed America.
Right. I know we haven't touched on all the books that you've written about, but I do want to very quickly talk. Out of the 10 books, you devote 2 to Pete Rose. And just if you can tell us really quickly the decision behind that.
This is certainly an example of 2 books that I would not consider among the best books about baseball. But I think they were influential in the sense that it's a stretch to say that Pete Rose led to Donald Trump, but I think they had much in common. I think Rose's books appealed to the same sort of disillusioned white collar Americans who felt that the system was screwing them. And Rose captured that well in his books, his later books. And I think in his and his fans feeling that they were screwed by Giamatti. I mean, of course, Rose was guilty. He did ultimately admit that he bet on baseball, but the feeling that the system was rigged against him was a feeling that he captured in two of his books. And I think it was a feeling that Donald Trump captured in his books and in his campaigns. So while I would really not go so far as to say that, the reason Donald Trump became president was because of Pete Rose and his books, I think they were part of a similar movement in America.
I just wanted to briefly mention there is another chapter about other influential books in here where you mentioned a bunch, and it's quite an enjoyable book. Anyone who is interested in baseball literature should certainly pick up a copy of The Lineup: 10 Books That Changed Baseball by Paul Aron. Paul, thank you very much for chatting with us today.
Thank you, Ron. I appreciate it.